Get ready to rumble. Schilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed Podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting schillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast welcomes Dr. Jeremy M. Levin, Executive Chairman and founder of Ovid Therapeutics, author of the new book Biotech and the Balance, Saving a Strategic Industry in the Age of Distrust. And Dr. Levin, thank you so much for joining us this morning on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
That's great. Thanks, Rob. It's a real pleasure to do this with you.
Would you tell us about your company, Ovid Therapeutics, and what you do?
Ovid Therapeutics is a company that was founded to tackle diseases of the brain that others wouldn't tackle. And we deal with the side of the brain diseases which are generated by hyperexcitability. These are things that people know about in epilepsy, autism, schizophrenia, the things that really, when your brain is excited and you've got a high level of activity, you can't control your body. And so that's what we've been spending time on, and we've got some great programs in that. It's early, but with a bit of luck, we're going to be able to bring brand new medicines into a world which needs them very badly.
We hear the term biotech an awful lot, but many people in the regular listening audience may not understand exactly what we're talking about. So when we reference biotech, what do we mean by that?
It's a very important word. It was first used roughly in the 1970s. And what it means is that unlike for years and years and years, the pharmaceutical companies had developed a way of finding chemicals that you gave to somebody to change a disease. We saw this. It's like aspirin. It's like Tylenol. You basically have a chemical, you take it, and it changes the disease, but you're not 100% sure about, at the time, what it does or how it works. Biotechnology is very different. Biotechnology is developed in 1973, where for the first time we started to unpack all the pieces of the human cell. And that's terribly important. You were looking at genes, you were looking at proteins, you were looking at what was on the surface of the cell. And biotechnology began to unpack that and say, well, wait a second, you've got these incredible molecules inside the cell and on its surface that we should understand, and let us take them and turn them into a medicine. And that's a very technical approach. For a little while, it was a bit of a dream. And then something rather magical happened actually in San Francisco, where one scientist turned to what was venture capital, somebody who had never before spent money at all in trying to figure this out, and said, look, I might be able to make a medicine by thinking through what are the pieces of the cell and what I should be tackling. And the venture capitalist said, that's crazy, but I'm willing to put money onto it. And from that moment, in 1973, it took a little while, but by 1976, one of the major companies, one of the best medical companies ever actually, called Genentech, was born. And from there, we gave birth to what today is an industry which is largely unseen. And you're right, Rob, it's really very much unseen. It's an industry of over 1,000 different companies. All are overwhelmingly spending money to find new medicines. They don't make profits, the vast majority. They sell their stock to raise capital to try and find a new medicine. They're full of researchers. And it transpires that the United States, because of that event in 1973, is today the single largest, if not the leader, overwhelmingly the most productive in the world of finding new medicines. And these medicines are extraordinary. They're the ones that knock back and can cure cancer. They're the ones that have knocked back and killed and really taken out of the picture hepatitis C. They develop extraordinary capabilities, and it's only begun. Now we're in the phase of where we are beginning to use the very cells of the human body as treatments. We're able to transport genes into human cells, a whole exciting panoply of innovations. So from that little starting point in 1973 to where we are today is a remarkable evolution, and a fundamentally American evolution, something that couldn't have happened anywhere else in the world. And I think it's something that we in America should be proud of. But as you say, the person in the street has probably never heard of them, although I venture to guess that they've taken a medicine that was developed in that industry, because 70% of all new medicines today, every single one of them, in cancer, in diabetes, everywhere, was developed in a small, tiny little biotech company and eventually transported to patients through the giant pharmaceutical companies.
Let's talk about the difference between traditional pharmacy and pharmaceuticals versus this newer technology. Is it really a matter of precision and personalization, or are there other factors in addition to those?
In the early days, it was very much a difference between understanding the biology of the cell that made a huge difference. To be perfectly honest, in many cases, the pharmaceutical companies who early on in their life cycle, which they really just tried out chemicals, and if there was an effect, they developed them. They didn't quite know often how they worked. That's not true, strictly true for things like antibiotics, but it is true for many of the others. They were empiric. In other words, they saw what the drug did and they built on it, having made sure that it was safe. That's different. In biotech, you unpack the cell, you figure out what's going on inside it, and you become much more precise in what you do. Over the years, things have changed. At the beginning, the large pharmaceutical companies completely dismissed this area as being a waste of time. Remarkable, actually, because as I say, today, 70% of all of their medicines come from it. But it's a long time ago, 1973 to now. And what's happened during that period of time is slowly, members of the pharmaceutical companies have joined the biotech community and vice versa. But the engine, the fundamental engine of innovation resides in those 1,000 plus companies, the really small guys. The other side to the equation is the partner, which is the large pharmaceutical company, and they're engines of selling, distributing, and manufacturing. They're less in the business of being highly innovative. They don't necessarily find new medicines. They sell new medicines. That's what they basically do. And they're very good at doing that, except that, as you and I know, often people are very concerned about the pricing of the drugs they get.
There has been allegations that Big Pharma often quashes better drugs or better biotechs because they have an investment, quote unquote, in a particular drug and they want to get their money out of it. Is there a reason to fear that as we look at innovation and moving forward?
You know, the great thing about competition is that if one company ever were to do that, their competitors would like nothing better than to lay their hands on a competitive drug and get it into the market. It's not as if these large companies are conspiring to keep things off. What they often do, and that is very much the case, is that if one company has a drug that they believe in and then something looks slightly better, they probably won't touch it. They won't do an agreement with a biotech company. Now, sometimes that is really a mistake, a big mistake. For example, there is a company called Lundbeck who had a marvelous drug which was treating epilepsy. But the thing that they did was that it causes side effects. That epilepsy was epilepsy in children. And they simply used it, sold it, and it caused side effects in children. But because it was so effective, they kept on selling it. Well, along came an opportunity to develop a brand new drug without those side effects. By the time they looked at it, they decided, nope, they were making money on the other drug. They weren't going to develop it. So they did nothing until one day the patents on their drug expired, and their drug, which was $1 billion drug at that time, fell to nearly nothing because nobody needed to buy it at the prices that they were charging. At the same time, and here's where Ovid came in, Ovid decided, no, we need a better drug in that area. And that's exactly why we picked it up, and we've developed a brand new one, and hopefully it will be successful. It's called 329. And if it is successful, then it will validate the process of doing a new drug, even though it might look a little bit like the old drug, but it's much better, has much better side effect profile. So you are correct. There are two ways that companies don't pick up a drug. One, if they just don't have the vision to go on to something better. But then you always have either a small company like an Ovid or another competitor company who will immediately jump on this and say, well, that's fine for you, but we're going to do it.
Dr. Levin, what about the costs of liability? In other words, this is a very touchy situation. You're dealing with people in their lives when you go to these trials and so forth. And that must be a huge cost to protect yourself from possible liability, although I'm sure you protect yourself in other ways as well, just by being careful.
You know, it's a very important point you make, but I think that the vast majority of people in this industry, and there's 1,000 companies in the biotech industry, start off with a premise. They have a covenant with the patient. That means that they will never develop a drug that could cause harm if they possibly can avoid it. And they most certainly can avoid it by the proper testing. Sometimes unavoidable things happen because the human body is so complex. So what we do is we first of all organize incredibly expensive clinical trials to ensure safety, and we do the very best things we can to do that. Following that, our next step is to, of course, know that there are people who could have a side effect and they may sue. So you have to get liability insurance to cover you. I wish that weren't the case, but mistakes happen. What you don't want to do is you want to make sure that you've done anything that could possibly be negligent. You want to do something that is incredibly thorough. So you do have to take insurance. That's an obligation, but it's not something that you would be doing other than protecting your shareholders and yourselves from a suit that often comes. And many of these suits are quite frivolous, to be perfectly honest. Not all, I want to be clear, not all, but many are.
What about chronic diseases? Does that make a difference in how this is approached? And what about the right to try if people are in a position of desperation and they're willing to step forward and put themselves out kind of as a test?
You know, that's such an important thing. Again, chronic diseases are different from the right to try. So let's try and break that down into two questions. In the case of the right to try, I think this is one of the most troubling ethical things that we face in our society. If somebody is dying of a cancer, if every other treatment has failed and they know that they face a mortality ahead of them, they are willing to do anything. Some people are so desperate that they want to try something, and they must try something in their minds. What you want to avoid is charlatans, the people who are pushing ideas without any idea whatsoever that they will do any benefit. An example is Laetrile. It's an extract. Well, you have people who are desperate to try anything, and then you have these charlatans selling basically snake oil, no evidence whatsoever. Doesn't mean the person can't try them. Doesn't mean that they shouldn't try them. It simply means, sadly, they need to go into these things with their eyes open. Now, there's something else. In this instance, we know that there are many early clinical trials where you have a very rigid, very specific clinical trial, and where individuals suddenly say, well, we've heard about this clinical trial and we want to try that drug before it is approved. Here, it's not really up to the biotech company. Here, the biotech company and the pharmaceutical company are constrained by things that are beyond our control. One, the FDA says, well, if that patient tries it, great. But if that results in some harm or they die, you need to include all that data in the clinical trial. In other words, you now have a situation where your entire process, the millions and millions of dollars that you're spending to rigorously try to see if there is an effect, becomes distorted by one or two individuals. Not that they don't have the right instincts, they want to try it, but there is no evidence that that drug could work or might work yet, and yet we have to include the data. And an adverse event where somebody is desperately ill and was going to die anyway, unfortunately then can have a dramatic effect on what could be a life-saving drug for others if the clinical trial had gone ahead. So I think it's very important to distinguish from people who are pushing drugs. It's their right to try it, from those that are in clinical trials and require extraordinary rigidity. And unfortunately, that's the scientific method. I do think, though, there is zero doubt that if we're able to reform some of the thinking in the FDA, if we're able to get guidance and acceptance about liability, then perhaps there are ways that we can get some of these medicines to patients earlier before they're fully tried out. But I don't think that's easy to do at all. I think it's extremely difficult because if you upend scientific method, you're into the business of being a shaman, a magical process, as opposed to something which is rigidly scientific. I'll finish by simply saying every person really faces that moment in their lives where they hope they can get cured. The problem is that if you allow some of the charlatans who are out there to push ideas on you, you get false hope, which I think is far worse than anything else.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues in a moment with our guest, Dr. Jeremy Levin.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
SchillingShowMedia.com will take your project from conception to completion.
SchillingShowMedia.com is reasonably priced and highly professional.
Need a website for your business? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Need a video created or edited? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
Have a photography or graphic design project? Visit SchillingShowMedia.com.
SchillingShowMedia.com is your one-stop shop for websites, audio and video production, and photography.
Visit SchillingShowMedia.com. That's SchillingShowMedia.com.
Looking out for us. Rob Schilling.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. The book is Biotech and the Balance. Dr. Jeremy M. Levin is our guest. Let's go to the topic of distrust. This is a big issue, and I think it's been exponential with the growth of social media and the internet where things can be put out there. So what's going on with distrust and how is it being combated?
You know, it's perhaps the poster child for distrust is vaccines. And it didn't start yesterday. It didn't start a year ago with the new administration. It started back in the 1980s with Andrew Wakefield publishing a completely fallacious article in a world-class scientific journal the journal The Lancet decided to publish it against the advice of its own editors, but the then editor, Dr. Horton, decided it was of public interest and proceeded to publish it. It took nearly 10 years for that paper to be retracted, although the evidence behind it was refuted within a very short period of time. Indeed, Dr. Wakefield was expelled from his medical profession, and many of the co-respondents on his paper withdrew all of their support. The problem there, this poster child was exactly what you said, Rob. 2 minutes after that great magazine published it, it was out. Newspapers picked it up. They said vaccines caused autism. That spiraled. It continued to spiral. It grew, it grew, it grew, it grew until it became its own reality. In fact, it was all built on a falsehood, a complete falsehood. And when we face this terrible moment in 2020, when that virus, COVID-19, swept across our borders, we were completely unprepared. We didn't have communications. We did not have the ability to stand up in front of an audience of the public in America to say with definitive ease, here is the evidence. Here is why it works. This is why we need to be fighting this. This is what the vaccines are. This is what we need. And then it got confounded by, should we be wearing a mask? Should we not be wearing a mask? Should a child of under 1 year old get a vaccine? Should a child under the age of 5 get a vaccine? Should they get a vaccine at all? Should we close schools? All of this became amplified immensely, and led to huge distrust in public speaking about science. This was a great disservice to the United States. And against that backdrop, the really extraordinary efforts in Project Warp Speed, which the then President Trump initiated and put onto the table, without Warp Speed, it wouldn't have been 1.3 million Americans that died, that did die. It would have been 20 or even 30 million Americans that died. So there was confusion, distrust, and that has led and been amplified in the last 7 years to a point where now you have people who are really declining to have straightforward vaccines like measles, and we're seeing terrible effects of that across this country, spreading like wildfire. Kids who should never have got sick. You're seeing mumps. You're seeing all sorts of disorders which should never have, we thought we'd really beaten back. And that's a tragedy. So the distrust has immense consequences, not just on people, but then industrially. And I can talk about how it's had an effect industrially, but it's much more important to focus on the people. The distrust that we've created in science has had direct consequence on people believing facts.
Dr. Levin, what could we have done differently? And I want to bring an example to you. The process of all of this and the mandates and so forth, which had people pretty uncomfortable, but also just the fact that when you have this vaccine and then they change the definition of it in the dictionary, people start getting nervous, and rightfully so. So I want you to address the process overall and what we could have done differently to prevent some of the problems that you referenced.
A long time ago, we should have stamped out emphatically, and all of the scientific journals should have stamped out emphatically the falsehood that was propagated by that first Andrew Wakefield paper. That would have been the base. The second point is that every administration should have been extraordinarily careful in establishing the direct communications of what is factual and what is not factual in an epidemic. We didn't do that. We had initially a group that was prepared for this, but they were disassembled some years ago. we failed in our ability to communicate with the American public a simple message. One, the overwhelming fact is that vaccines are safe. Two, that the American government and its agencies are well capable of developing a really safe and effective vaccine, even in the face of a pandemic of the kind that we face, and better than anybody else in the world. Let me just repeat that, better than anybody else in the world. And we should be able to communicate that with one clear voice. And I think the real problem here at the end of the day is with all of the diverse types of input and social media, etc., our failure to address this in a clear, simple language, a communication style that every single person understands, not just in Wyoming, but in New Orleans, not just in Miami, but in Muscle Shoals. The language should have been the kind of language that every person understands, and that we should have been prepared for. I believe we were not prepared for that, and as a consequence, various experts were put up to explain things, and quite rightly, unfortunately, that led to a tremendous amount of confusion.
Dr. Levin, finally, where do we go from here? What's the future and what can we expect in the next decade and beyond?
Well, I think the really critical thing is that if America chooses to take one of two routes, different outcomes will occur. One route is to say that we, America, our leadership sees that biotechnology is of strategic consequence to this nation. It is the defense we'll use against the next pandemic. It is the industry that will develop a cure for Alzheimer's. And from that strategic asset statement, we'll begin to rebuild the trust in the scientific institutions we have, in the FDA that we should have, the CDC that we so desperately need, and in the academic institutes which feed this enormous industry and give certainty to the investment that American capital can produce phenomenal innovation and will continue to do that. The other route is something different. We ignore this industry. We let the FDA continue to be stripped of its capabilities. We let the NIH deteriorate after having founded it in 1947. We let academic centers, and we insist that they have politicized science. This will be a gift. Let me repeat. This will be a gift to America's competitors because they have copied what we have done in our institutions and are now creating an enormous engine of potential innovation abroad. We can compete against this if we're given the chance. But if we're not, in 5 years' time, we will most certainly see a situation where the vast majority of new medicines are not being delivered from America. They're being sourced, created, and developed abroad. And one day there's going to come a moment when perhaps somebody abroad will have discovered the cure for Alzheimer's, and America will have to go cap in hand and say, can we bring this to our nation? So there are two choices, and it's now. That's why we're in balance.
Dr. Levin, if people would like to get a copy of your book, Biotech in the Balance, Saving a Strategic Industry in the Age of Distrust, tell us how, please.
The best way to get the book right now, it's on Amazon. It's in 3 different forms. I narrated the audiobook. There is a Kindle and there's also a hardback. People want to communicate with me, they can most certainly do so on LinkedIn. I'm there, and I would welcome the opportunity.
Dr. Jeremy Levin, it's a fascinating book. You've done a good job making the case. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Rob, thank you so much for the time. I certainly would love to see Charlottesville, Virginia. I've done it once or twice. It's great. And so you're in a great spot down there.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at schillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,